Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and I'm here with Jack today because we are going to be tackling the topic of the best decks in Standard post Guardians Rising. It's a video that we did for Sun and Moon and it got a lot of good reception, so we thought we'll bring it back this time in a very similar format. So we'll be going through the best decks currently before Guardians Rising, then we'll look at the new introductions, then we will look at what the current decks gain and lose, and how that will pretty much mean bringing it all together towards the end, summing up what we feel the direction of the format will be going. So plenty to discuss, and we'll start off with the current top 10 decks in the format.
So yeah, these top 10 decks have kind of proved themselves over the past 3 months worth of tournaments. This isn't necessarily in the best order, but these are pretty much the 10 archetypes that I think most people will consider the top 10 archetypes right now. Obviously, all of these have seen top cuts, seen success in the various different regionals we've had over the past few months. So yeah, this was where we're at pre-Guardians Rising, and now the set's pretty much here. We're going to be looking at how these decks change a little bit later on. But starting us off with the new stuff, we have Trevenant. There's a lot of different decks we're going to be talking about, but we know we've kind of split them up into things that we think are definitely going to make an impact and things that will be more meta dependent. So Trevenant, Vileplume, Tauros, Garb, and Sylveon, from early testing, all of these archetypes are really, really strong. They all sort of hold their own against these new these old decks, along with some of these new archetypes as well. And then in the could be good category, again, these are going to be the ones that sort of are a bit more meta dependent, a bit more list dependent. Maybe won't be as successful right off the bat until we've got real solid lists for them, or they've been refined a little bit more. But they could all see top tier play. So yeah, we're going to be talking about all 9 of these decks. The 2 main trends we're seeing is there's 2 real new energy denial archetypes. So that's the meta's going to have to shift around that. We're going to have to think more about how we can best make our decks work against these new archetypes. And obviously we do get Aqua Patch in this set, which is huge, meaning water actually becomes, I think, potentially a really relevant type with the right sort of list and backing behind it.
Yeah, definitely. Those 3 on the left-hand side of the screen, those are going to be established archetypes, I think. They all offer something new and something powerful. And as you say, the ones on the right, there's no reason why they couldn't start popping up. It's just from our early testing, we've not seen the most success from them, but that doesn't mean they can't come out and lists will change, and in the right spots they could be good. So let's start off with the 3 definitely decent decks. With Trevenant Vileplume, it's a pretty powerful archetype. It has spread damage potential when you actually use Trevenant Break. I think from early testing we've tried a 4-4-3 line of Trevenant. With the breaks, you can actually evolve into Trev Break on turn 1 because the lower forms are both grass type, the Phantump and the Trev. So you can go into the fake stage 2 on turn 1 and start getting Silent Fears off as early as turn 2. Of course, you're going to have Item Lock backing that up with Vileplume, just like the old Trevenant really. Item Lock plus Silent Fear, we've seen that combo be devastating in the past because Lysander stalling just gives you so much damage, and this time we have the backup attack for just a DCE, which means you can get over big threats quite quickly and leave your opponent with not much board. And when they don't have many attacks on the board, Silent Fear just gets more powerful. So having the backup Poltergeist is really, really strong. You get over a lot of decks just because you can 1 or 2 shot their main threat, and then because of Item Lock, it's hard for them to continue getting attackers going. And throughout that time, you're putting things into nicer ranges, setting up Shamans for KOs, etc. The biggest weaknesses of Trev Plume is going to be maintaining those attackers, whether or not your Poltergeists actually do enough damage to deal with their attacker. If for some reason, just based on chance, your opponent has only like 1 or 2 trainers in their entire hand, it means that you're not doing much. They just overcome you. And because you've got your own Item Lock established, it's not going to be too easy for you to recover and get a second Trevenant going and a third one, especially because you only run 4 copies of DC in the deck. You have to cycle and try and fight them. And under Vileplume, it's hard to cycle cards. And yeah, that leads on to the second weakness of the deck, is that the output isn't always in your control. Sometimes you just have to gamble on turns and cross your fingers, hoping that you can get a KO. If it does work out for you, that's great, but sometimes your opponent just may not have a hand for whatever reason. They can play around you to an extent, just by lowering their hand size as much as possible, sycamoring when they do have lots of items in the hand, etc. Or ending when it becomes mid to late game, just so they have a lower hand size. All these things your opponent will be trying to do. Even some sort of tech supporters like Misty's Determination may be seeing play, because that's technically like a minus 60 from hand, and you are able to find a relevant card from the top 8. So who knows, there may be shifts to try and counter Trevenant in some regard, but just trying to say that it can be vulnerable if your opponent just randomly doesn't have a powerful hand of their own full of items. So potentially an issue for the deck.
Yeah, for sure. I think the fact that you can't always rely on the exact output is going to be one of Trev's biggest weaknesses. But just Vileplume alone can win games. So it's like, yeah, it is a weakness, but also there will be games that you just cheese your opponent out by getting a turn 1 Vileplume and them never really drawing out of that lock. So yeah, I think Trevenant Vileplume is definitely going to be an archetype that a lot of decks have to think about and think about their win condition against.
Yeah, definitely. And another quick note is that this could be the item lock variant that has the favourable matchup against the other item lock variant that we have in the format, because it's easier for Trevenant just to get a stage 1 out than it is to get multiple stage 2s out. So if you're the one that gets the plume established, you're probably better off against the Decidueye players. So I think it has a slight edge in the Vileplume v Vileplume matchups, which is interesting to note. So maybe there'll be a divide between players going for Decidueye Plume and Trev Plume, based on just the fact that not everyone likes item lock in the first place, and they're very much similar builds. But we could see a divide between those sorts of players, so that's an interesting shift in the meta, I think.
Yeah. Next up, we have Tauros Garb, an archetype that sort of saw a little bit of play towards the start of Sun and Moon. Obviously, Tauros is a pretty strong card inherently anyway. But now we have the addition of the new Garb, that has the really strong attack. Pretty much, it has the potential to one-shot anything, depending on the amount of items in your opponent's discard. It's got the late game that Tauros Garb kind of sometimes struggled with. In the early turns, just being able to Horn attack and apply 60 for a DCE and always threaten Rage or Mad Bull later on was really, really strong. But by the time your opponent was set up, maybe they were able to get to the point where they could one-shot Tauros. The deck kind of fizzled out. It ran things like Lugia and stuff to try and have more of a late-game edge sometimes. But the late game was definitely where the deck had its weak points. But now we have this shell, but we also have a late-game attacker in the new Garb, and it's not like we're adding too much to the deck anyway, because the deck was running Garb anyway. So it just really fits really well in the deck. So as you can see with the strengths, Ability Lock and Heavy Disruption are kind of what this deck was all about before. You would Horn attack and take these really efficient, or do this really efficient damage whilst hammering away your energy, and then ability locking your opponent so they couldn't draw into more energy, they couldn't draw in with shaman and things, they couldn't naturally set up the way they wanted. So the deck still, the deck's early game is pretty much the exact same as it has been, but then towards the late game you are able to set up this non-EX attacker and be able to start one-shotting your opponent's bigger Pokemon that they've set up to try and take on these Tauros themselves. So that combined with Mad Bull means that you pretty much guarantee 2 big knockouts towards the late game, towards the mid to late game, meaning that you only have to get one knockout, one EX or GX knockout from Horn attack plus Rage style attacks to be able to sort of successfully close out a game. If you can do that earlier on, then you can rely on Mad Bull GX in the mid game, and then the new Garbodor's attack in the late game. So it just kind of fits really well into the deck. The big weakness, obviously, or one of the big weaknesses, of course, is the opponent kind of dictates the damage. They don't have to play their items. Obviously, it's going to hurt their setup if they do, or if they do go down that route. But essentially, they could go the whole game without playing items, meaning that you never do get to this late game. It is going to mean Tauros perhaps is a little bit more oppressive in the early game because they're not able to set up as they want. But that could be a natural way of being able to overcome this deck and provide no sort of real late game attacker sometimes. And then Energy Denial, obviously this was a big thing with Tauros before. It only ran 4 DC a lot of the time, so Energy Denial was always a bit annoying anyway. You are running more energy naturally now because of Garbodor, because you need Psychic Energy. So it's less of a problem than it was maybe with the just the quad DCE build that we've seen post Sun and Moon. But that being said, it's not going to be a high energy count. You're not going to have loads, so you are going to have to really conserve your own resources as well, just to avoid running out of energy and not being able to close out the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this archetype. I think it's improved so much. Its early game is improved because now Horn Attack with Choice Band is 90 for a DCE. That's like really gross, and it basically forces the opponent to start finding answers and start cycling through their deck to deal with Tauros. 90 for DC is just so good. So they can't just sit around doing nothing. They have to start playing their items. They have to start max elixiring to get into their bigger attacks to overcome a Tauros. Otherwise, they fall into Mad Bull GX range. And by the time they hit mid to late game, especially with like field blowers and crushing hammers and stuff, forcing the opponent to start drawing more cards, the Garblor just gets into one-hit range. And when it does that, it's really disgusting. It just announces its attack twice and wins the game. So I think this is a really, really strong archetype. Not many issues, I don't think. Even though we've said the weakness is that the opponent can dictate damage, that's only really half the story, because you're doing like a minimum 90 for a single attachment on a Tauros, so that's like not bad at all. And it only gets better from there. So I think it only has a couple of bad matchups. I think Ninetales is actually one of the hardest matchups for this deck, because Tauros can Horn Attack like twice while Ninetales is just sniping the bench. And then they can GX attack on you and fully heal off and KO the Tauros. And because they have the Vulpix as well, they don't need to actually play that many item cards, so they can stay out of one-hit range from the Garbodor. And they have like things like Rough Seas. So maybe Ninetales will be in the format just because it has a good matchup against this deck, because this feels like it's almost a tier 1 deck, like from the offset, just based on how people's lists currently are built. I think it will lead to a change in how we build lists. I think we have to move away from heavy item draw. Maybe Trainer's Mail becomes a forgotten card in the format where we need to find alternative ways to draw cards instead, because just feeding people like a free 60 or 80 damage by how many Trainer's Mails you're playing in the deck, it just ruins you. So I think early on in the season, Tauros Garb is going to be a really strong archetype, and then people will start having to begrudgingly adapt their lists and go to slower performance. And that's not even a bad thing, because the Tauros is good in the early game. So I think this is just a really, really solid and scary deck to play against. Next up, we have another very scary deck to play against, Sylveon GX. The strengths of this deck is that it has the most ridiculous search engine I think we've ever seen in Pokemon. A single attachment gets you to tutor 3 any cards from your deck and put them into your hand. We're combining this with so many disruption cards, all the annoying supporters, Skullgrunt, Flare Grunt, Delinquent, Lysander to stall, all these sorts of supporters, all sorts of items. We can get Puzzle of Time back to access our discard pile to recycle. We're going to play Crushing Hammers. We're just going to play all the annoying cards, really, and make sure that it's hard for the opponent to take 6 prizes in a similar way that we've seen Quad Lapras previously. This card is almost on par in terms of tankability. You can even choose to play Rough Seas in your list, because you can play Jolteon or Vaporeon as your tech one of, and you can have Rough Seas to heal yourself, which could even be a reasonable avenue to go down. I think Alola Muck may even find its way into the list to help out your Volcanion matchup, which is really hard. I think that's one of the only issues I see for Sylveon right now, that I don't see a fantastic win condition against Volcanion, especially because Volk gains Turtonator GX, which is like really good for energy recovery and output even. So Sylveon has a long list of good matchups, I think. Its weaknesses are against one-hit KO decks. Just like Quad Lapras, you can lose just in the first 1 or 2 turns because your opponent just swarms you and takes big knockouts straight away, and you can't establish your control on the game at that point so early on. And the only other issue would be energy recovery cards. Things like a non-EX Volcanion, Baby Yveltal, the new Rayquaza. Even though that has a DC attack cost, that could still be annoying for you because it recovers 2 energy itself. Things like Carbink, if Lycanroc's going to see play. These would all be really annoying cards to deal with for Sylveon. Even the Energy Keeper Carbink is going to be annoying. maybe that's another reason why people will play a Alolan Muck, because otherwise that's just like a one card tech that can almost beat Sylveon at times. So there are ways that Sylveon has to adapt based on how popular it will be. Right now, though, I think in terms of main decks in the format, I think really Volcanion's the only hurdle that it has to overcome, that it naturally can't just beat, because I think right now every other deck, this deck has the tools to beat just in a long game situation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at the weaknesses, Volcanion does both of those. It one hit knocks out things, and it has energy recovery, so it's naturally going to be a bad matchup. But against the majority of the other decks in the format, it's just so oppressive. The search engine, I think, is what makes this card so good. It's being able to find all of the disruption you want, all of the relevant disruption for this game. Maybe they're not run. You've seen that they're not. It's just a quad DCE deck, so you're just going to be looking for ways to disrupt DCE. You can start searching out exactly what you want, and the fact that it's able to start on turn one as well. It's like collect, but you search the three cards instead because you have the ability with the EV. So I think this deck is definitely really, really oppressive. There are a couple of natural weaknesses, as we've said. I also think turn one hex is, if your opponent starts and turn one hexes you, that can be an issue for the deck, just because you can't evolve up your EVs. So you have to naturally maybe play a Lele down or play another Pokemon down just to avoid being benched. But if your opponent doesn't find that turn one hex, then you're just setting up as normal. You're finding the exact card you want for the next turn. I just think the deck is super consistent, as we've both said, super oppressive, and definitely could be an issue. We've seen how Quad Lapras has just sort of gained so much steam. It's not necessarily the best deck in format or top of tier 1, but we saw how quickly this deck sort of gained popularity after we first saw it in places like Malmo. It's now definitely one of the most talked about archetypes, I think, over the past few weeks, and Sylveon just seems to do it a little bit better. So I think that there's no way we can't consider this, going into the new format, consider this being one of the best new decks out of this set. Next up, we have Lurantis. Lurantis is a deck that we've profiled on the channel already. Essentially, its engine just gets so much better, and its numbers and things like that. Lurantis was one of the first cards we saw into the Sun and Moon set, and everyone said how busted this card was, being able to Flower Supply 2 energy back, and then take one-shots on anything and heal yourself with 210 HP. There's nothing bad about this card. It just never quite hit the right numbers. But now it's got the right numbers, as well as a decent second attacker as well. I think the deck definitely could present itself in the format. Having natural energy acceleration, as we've said, is going to be really, really useful in this format, especially against all of these decks that are trying to run you out of energy. Just being able to, for one energy, attach two more, means that you are naturally going to win this race at some point, especially as you're doing damage as well. There's some cards that attach energy that don't really do damage, but you're also applying pressure as well. And with Non-EX Lurantis and Choice Band, it moves it up to 90 against EXs and GXs, so it's not even an irrelevant number. It's actually an important number. So it means that against these kind of decks, you're never really losing that race now. You're not only recovering your energy, but you're also applying a fairly decent amount of pressure. The fact you can heal as well, just means that as long as it's not a Volk sitting against you, it's going to be really, really difficult for something to one-shot you. And you're going to get more and more value out of your Lurantises. I think this card is still really, really good. It's got a lot of options to it. Having acceleration, healing, and the blow-up ability that Lurantis has, I just think it's got a lot sort of going for it anyway, especially with the potential rise in water Pokemon as well. There's not many water Pokemon that aren't weak to grass. There's a couple that are weak to metal now, but a lot of them are weak to grass, so you're just going to pick up more and more favorable matchups as well. The weakness is fire weakness is an issue. Volk doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So the win condition against Volk is very, very loose. I think you've got to really roll the dice and roll high to be able to win against Volk. It's not unwinnable, but it's never going to be fun. You're never going to want to see a Volk. It's just never going to be fun for you. And the list is kind of somewhat item heavy as well, which means that you find it difficult to play around Garb. You have to put a lot of. You can obviously set up really quickly against as the Lurantis deck, having access to Forest, but you do require a lot of items to do so, which means that you kind of play into Garb's hands as well. So there are some issues for the deck, and that's why this is the sort of shift into the decks that aren't necessarily going to be straight into the high tiers as we go into the format. But maybe once they've been more refined, we're going to start seeing decks like this come out in these big tournaments.
Yeah, we've seen previously that as soon as a new set drops, people remain cautious and will play the already established archetypes. So I imagine Volk will still be too high on the radar for Lurantis to see a huge amount of play. But maybe as we progress, Lurantis has some great matchups. I think it's got a good Tauros garb, as long as you remain fairly conservative with your items. And I think it's got a really good Sylveon, and those are two important matchups to have. And if Volk remains popular, which I don't see a reason why not, then Aquabox will be coming back out in force, and then you're the one countering the counter deck. So Lurantis has a lot of good matchups, and as you say, just the numbers become so sweet that the deck is actually like inherently good enough to play. It's not like you're playing the counter deck now, you're just playing a deck that's good enough that has one bad matchup, and that's Volk. So maybe if we can try and tailor Volk better. We have Tapu Bulu and Tapu Lele, which can both like survive hits against Volk if you're playing Hex on those turns. But unfortunately, they're still 2-hitting, so it's like a 2-hit war regardless, and you're the one having to play Hex Maniacs and stuff. So it's never going to be that favourable for you. But yeah, I think if you can... Either we figure out Volk some way, even if we're playing like Araquanid or something silly like that. This has a long list of good matchups, so keep an eye out for Lurantis. I think one day it will be in the format. Next up we have Lycanroc Hammers. Lycanroc gains the new GX version that has Dangerous Rogue GX, which is a really powerful one-hit option, and it also has Bloodthirsty Eyes to have the Lysander effect in an ability, which is really good. It also gains Brooklet Hill to get more Rockruffs down and get your Carbinks going quickly, so the archetype does gain a little bit. I think it has quite a few decent matchups with its Energy Denial, with Crunch plus Hammers. You'll be playing Wobbuffet in the list to have a much better time against things like Decidueye and Trevplume. So having good item lock matchups is really good for you. I think that's like one of the first hurdles we need to get over in the format. If you're playing Carbink, you probably have a decent Sylveon as well. So those are, again, a lot of good matchups for Lycanroc to keep in mind. Your weaknesses to Grass, which isn't too big of an issue because we're going to be just energy locking the Trev and the the Trevenant and the Decidueye anyway, so not too big of an issue. Strengths involve just the energy denial and the fact that you have one hit KO potential now with the new GX, so I think Lycanroc does peep into the format a bit because it has some good matchups. Its weaknesses are its speed. You're playing two separate stage 1s, and one of your stage 1s is a split stage 1. We're playing the new and the old Lycanroc GX, and we're playing Carbink, which is technically a stage 1 because of the break. So there's easily chances that you will start bricking out with this deck, especially when you're making spaces for things like Crushing Hammers and such. So that's probably an issue, and that just means that you're inconsistent as well as slow. But on paper, I think Lycanroc also has some good matchups and is improved just generally by the fact that you can now Bloodthirsty Eye things up or just take a big knockout on a powerful threat on the opponent's board.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've seen sprinklings of Lycanroc throughout the past couple of months anyway. And this new Lycanroc is only going to be an upgrade simply because it's just going to give the deck more options. It's going to even things like using less reliance on finding Lysander or finding the exact attacker you want. Both of these cards are good attackers. Both of their GX attacks pretty much guarantee a knockout, and both have good standard attacks anyway. So it's just another good card. I think the Grass weakness, it's not as big of an issue as it sometimes may seem, simply because of the energy denial aspect of the deck. But the energy denial is just going to depend on sort of who sets up first. If they can set up the Vileplume before you can find your Wobbuffets, then it's going to be difficult to ever get your lock going. But if you ever do get your lock going, I think it's really favourable for you, just because you're not item locked, and you're discarding energy sort of through multiple means. You're discarding, you can discard lots of energy and things like that. So I think it potentially, the weakness, like we say, isn't all that relevant, but it's just going to be whether this deck can keep up with the speed of some other decks. When we get onto the old decks that sort of change, we are going to see some matchups or some decks sort of maybe getting worse, which means there may not be as good a matchups in general for Lycanroc, I think. But even so, I think that this deck can actually provide a real. It's another deck that can provide a real oppressive sort of feel to it, whilst having that natural aggression that fighting types sort of give out. Next up, we have Tapu Koko, one of the first lightning Pokemon we've seen, or relevant lightning Pokemon we've seen in a little while. There's been splashes of Jolteon and the non-EX Jolteon and stuff, but this is one of the first attackers we've seen in a long time, so I think that's why a lot of people are naturally interested in this card. Energy retention is, I think, what this card does the best. The fact that you can chain your Tapu, provided you have your abilities, you can chain your Tapu Kokos. The fact you have no weakness means that you're going to be living a hit the majority of the time. As you can see, one of the only weaknesses is Oko Dex. The fact that you can live and retain your energy just means that it takes so much less reliance on attaching for turn and finding that attachment for turn, provided you're not against one of these decks that sort of denies the energy. You're going to have to find 3 energy in that game, and that potentially could be it. You can just consistently chain these Tapu Kokos. And the Oko potential, not only from the GX attack, I mean, the GX attack can one-shot pretty much anything anyway, but the fact that you have weakness on 2 relevant Pokemon right now, Ray and Yveltal, both have gone unchecked weakness-wise in a very long time. And there's been, like, people have been playing Zeb Striker and stuff. People have been throwing in evolutions just to try and make these matchups easier. The fact that we have just that lightning typing is really, really relevant. But you can Oko anything with the GX attack. It's another of these GX attacks that kind of just says take 2 prizes, which means that you can close out a game a lot quicker than your opponent may be expecting. It's kind of hard to play around as well, because if your opponent's not playing energy, then they're not setting their own board up. So there's going to be very rare times that this doesn't get a knockout because your opponent's sort of played around it, because it's going to mean they're slowing themselves down anyway. It is ability focused, and we've seen that Garb seems to be one of the best cards coming out of this new set. So it's going to, if you can't chain the Tapu Koko chain, I guess, it's going to mean that you can't sort of dodge. It's just kind of a mediocre attacker then. 3 energy for 130 is really good, but you have to manually attach these 3 energy or max elixir and things like that. So it may be an issue, just being naturally ability focused, depending on how oppressive Garb is. But that being said, if you can provide enough pressure, even sometimes against Garb, if you're able to sort of Lysander and get rid of the Trubbishes and stuff, sometimes that can be your win condition in that respect. And your GX attack obviously blows up Tauros, provided they start putting these energy onto Garbs to try and knock you out in the late game. So you have a win condition. It's just kind of awkward if they do set up the ability lock Garb in the early turns, which they're going to try to do anyway. And yeah, anything that can one shot you just means that you're an EX attacker, which does 3 for 130, which again is efficient numbers, but at that point you're having to attach 3 energy a turn. And the whole idea of the deck is being able to chain Tapu Koko, never lose his energy, and just dodge or make your opponent take awkward prizes on your other Pokemon on the bench rather than your attacker. So it's going to mean that if your opponent can just one-shot each Tapu Koko you throw out, you are going to have to try and take prizes in other means, at least try and stay in the game by attaching through Max Elixir and stuff much more quickly. But I think against some of the Oko decks, you have a favorable matchup anyway, so it could be okay. The fact that you have no weakness as well means that there are less. It's not like you're naturally going to be bad against one type of deck as well. It's going to mean that only decks that can naturally just hit these big numbers anyway are going to be decks that are able to one-shot you and take out all your energy quickly.
Yeah, I agree. I think Tapu Koko is a nice deck just because it's pretty simple. Spoiler alert, we'll be playing Energy Keeper Carbink in our list, so it will have a pretty good Sylveon matchup. The fact that you can keep getting a new Koko active against things like Decidueye is really strong, because that's a deck that can't one-hit KO you ever, so you don't really get a heal effect, but you can maintain attackers throughout that game, and that's going to be really strong for you. We'll probably play like double Hex, so things like Volcanion can't just one-bang you. And I think it has a fairly decent list of good matchups. I think the issue is that there are probably too many decks that can one-hit KO Tapu Koko, even with Fury Belts on, especially the fact that we have Field Blower, so they can take the Fury Belts off, and then you're just 170. 170 is not actually that hard to hit for a couple of decks. That's where Koko will probably fall down. It's probably a deck that just gets better in the following sets when we get Scoop Up and Acerola, but for now it could still be in and around. We'll see it on some tables, I think, because it does still have a handful of good matchups. It's pretty simple and gets the job done. Next up is Absol Serena. This is an archetype that a few people are scared of because not being able to play the game is pretty much the goal of this deck. The Serena has Queenly Majesty, which takes in a card from your opponent's hand and just discards it straight away. If you spam that with Devolution Spray, use things like Red Card or Judge in the early turns, and then start using Serena, you can put your opponent to an absolutely dead hand. And we have the new Absol, which looks at the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck and rearranges them. So the idea is you force them to not draw out of having nothing in hand. And then the Absol's second attack for an extra energy can start knocking things out as well. So it sounds like a really disgusting deck to play against. The disruption is almost universal. Everything but Sylveon or Lapras is really, really scared about this. If you get the combo off, where you hit your Forest, you hit your Serena, you start hitting Devo Sprays and use its ability 2 or 3 times. And yeah, if you're able to do that, that's really nuts. I think things like Garbodor already naturally being in the format, and the fact that this deck is going to need a load of items to get working. You need to play lots of Ball Search cards, lots of Mails, Devolution Sprays. I think Garbodor can start just one-hitting stuff for a single energy. And the fact that you have the ability lock in the first place. If you go first and just Floatstone Trubbish, I think you've already won the game. So yeah, I think it's a really fragile deck. I don't think this will ever be a top tier contender, just because Sylveon is going to be top tier, and Sylveon plays around this deck too often. I think Lapras could also be experimented with a lot just because of Aqua Patch as well. So yeah, I think there's a couple of bad matchups, but just one to keep an eye on, because people are going to try it in the early turns, because in the early testing of the new set, just because it's a really annoying combo.
Yeah, Serena was always talked about when the set was first released, so the fact that it's got a good attacker now means that people are going to be trying it again. The deck is inconsistent. That's always going to be one of its main crutches, and I think that's why the deck is potentially going to be just kind of in and around in the early few weeks. I don't think it's also going to. I also don't think it's going to be a top tier contender. But it is something that you have to keep. We are going to have to keep our eye on, and it's another thing that you don't want to accidentally play into and then just be locked out of the game for the rest of the game. So I think it's definitely worth testing, because it is a really annoying combo that can just lock your the universal disruption and control of the deck means that you don't naturally have bad. You can win against pretty much anything other than Sylveon. Sylveon just naturally tutors out the exact 3 cards it needs to stop your lock anyway. But against everything else, against most other things, having no hand means that they're not going to be able to do anything anyway. So you're just going to win the game naturally anyway. So it's definitely an archetype to keep in mind. It's just whether it's going to push itself into the higher tiers after the first few weeks of testing, or whether we're going to find that these other sort of control-y decks are better than it overall in testing. Next up, we have Ninetales, another GX from the set. This card, the fact that it's got 210 HP and has the water typing is just really good for the card. I think in general, I think it's one of the things that potentially makes this archetype viable overall. But yeah, being able to sit with 210 HP, having that much HP plus a GX attack that pretty much fully heals you and potentially takes a knockout as well, is just huge. It's going to mean that you can really flip the board state. And it's just going to be really, really nice being able to sort of deny your opponent all of that work that they've put into trying to knock out this 210 HP GX. The fact that you can set up under item lock with the new Vulpix is really, really good. You don't even need energy, which is super nice. It means that you can grab your Ninetales for next turn and then a Lele to guarantee a supporter or something like that. It's just really, really strong. Aqua Patch, we know that Dark Patch was a good card, is a good card and expanded. So Aqua Patch, there's no reason to believe it's not going to be a good card right now anyway. And just having the variability of a snipe attack and a big knockout attack and then healing as well just means that I think the deck naturally is going to present itself in some form in the format. It's got a lot of things going for it. Again, one shot KO decks are going to just find their way through these Ninetales quickly. It's going to mean that you're never going to really get a chance to use the GX attack, which is one of the real selling points of Ninetales. But 210 HP is more than the 170 that Tapu Koko has, so there are going to be less things that can one-shot you. The fact that you have a better typing against some of these one-shot decks as well, I think, is nice. And then Energy Denial can be a bit of an issue. We do have Aqua Patch, which is going to sort of hold it off maybe a little bit more. You're going to have 3 or 4 more attachments naturally than some of these other decks against Energy Denial, but it is still an issue for the deck. So it's not like the deck is flawless, but I think the card provides a lot of different sort of avenues to go down, and I think its GX attack is just one that can't be underrated at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is like the new age of Mewtwo in the format, with its GX attack being so strong. I like that this has good survivability against item lock with the Vulpix and potentially even Brooklet Hill if we want to play that instead of Rough Seas, but maybe a split of those. I like the sniping. Sniping's really good against things like Decidueye, I've found. And they can't really even start sniping onto you because of your GX attack as well, so they have to really time it well with their own attacks. So I think Ninetales has a decent amount of good matchups. Being a water type means you're probably okay against Volcanion when you have Aqua Patch to try and recover if they get one-hit KOs on you. I think our list is likely to play a Alolan Muck anyway, so we'll probably just one-hit the Volks while they can't respond, so that's probably a good matchup. There's a lot going for Ninetales. I was pretty close to putting this into a definitely good deck. It's just the teething issues of a new deck right now that we're still struggling with. And the fact that its actual attacks aren't that good is a bit of a worry. Like, Blizzard Edge isn't actually that good of an attack. Having to discard 2 energies is annoying, even if the 2 energies are DCE that we are playing in the list anyway. So, there's a few issues for the Alolan Ninetales. Its attacks aren't perfect, but there's a lot of support for water types that make it very, very viable. And the fact that it can survive item lock is a great stepping stone. And yeah, there's lots I like about Ninetales, and it's one that I've got on my radar for sure. Next up is the other water deck, Aquabox. This is not really like the Quad Lapras list that we've seen that are slow and try and play 4 Flare Grunt and all that annoying stuff. This is more like the traditional Aquabox, the kind that we saw at Worlds with Elixir support. Well, now we have Aqua Patch to try and recover some water energies. Energy recovery is going to be great because there's a few energy denial decks right now. Again, this might be a list that happens to play Energy Keeper Carbink. It seems like it's got a few good matchups. Lapras is going to be tanky because of, even with Field Blower, I think it's still a tanky Pokemon at 190 HP. Moving between your Laprases with Manaphy is going to be great. I don't know if we're going to be playing like 4 Elixir plus 4 Patch or some combination of the two. Maybe just Aqua Patch is good enough. I still need to test out this list more. But has a lot of good strengths. Collect in the early turns is going to help out against a lot of things. The free retreat option from Manaphy, we can get around Garbodor a lot better now because we have Field Blower. It also makes Blizzard Burn a more powerful attack because with a Choice Band or with a Fury Belt, we can one-hit stuff because we can take Fury Belts off the opponent's Pokemon. Its weaknesses involve its ability focus of Manaphy and the fact that it's really, really item heavy. If I was taking my own suggestion on board and playing 4 Elixir, 4 Aqua Patch, like, yes, you get 2 Laprases set up in like 2 turns, but Garbodor, the new Garb, can just start one-banging you anyway. So that's probably an issue. And the fact that they'll have normal Garb anyway. There'll be issues there, but overall I think just getting a buttload of energy into play and being tanky basics is really good in the format. And again, this is a deck that probably has a strong Volcanion, and that's a big tick for me right now because I think Volk is almost, or like maybe even the best deck in the format alongside like Decidueye, I think, in the new format from what I'm seeing in terms of matchups. So having a good matchup against that is going to be cool, and it's going to keep Volk in check, I think.
Yeah, it was naturally going to be a deck that was toyed around with when Aqua Patch was released or announced. So I think the deck, like everyone sees what the deck potentially has. It's just whether the lists can overcome things like the new Garb and anything that I think Garb is naturally just in general in both forms just a real issue for the deck. Just being like locking abilities and providing a non-EX attacker that can one-shot these huge Pokemon is always going to be an issue. But that being said, the combo was always sort of naturally there when we saw Aqua Patch revealed. So the fact that everyone thought it means that there must be something to the deck. So and Lapras has been seeing successful play anyway, so it's a good card in itself. So I think there's definitely merits to the deck, and we're going to see, as we've said, we're going to see that Volk seems to be one of the best decks going into the new format. So just being able to not worry about that too much and feel your matchup against that is relatively solid anyway. It's going to make things so much simpler when it comes to overcoming one of the big contenders in the upcoming format. So next up, we've talked about all of the new archetypes we want to talk about. This is the list of our list of the pre-Guardians Rising top 10 archetypes, not necessarily in the order that we think, but that being said, all of these archetypes have proved themselves. So we want to talk about each of these archetypes sort of in general and how they're going to change and what the new cards are going to do to the format, and what we're going to, or where we're going to see these, whether we're going to see these archetypes sort of stay in the format or perhaps peter out of existence.
Absolutely. We've decided to put things in 4 categories. They're either going to be declining, thriving, adapting, or just staying pretty much the same as non-movers in the format. This is something that we did last time, and I think a lot of people like this sort of system because, sure, it's all great that everyone goes out and tests the new archetypes, but oftentimes it's sort of forgotten that, you know, we still have all the current decks in format, and let's see how they are going to be changing and whatnot. So, these are the categories we've put them in.
Yeah. We've got the thriving, adapting, and then the non-movers and declining. And there may be a couple of surprises on there. I think but we're talking about every single one of these archetypes. So don't fret if you're seeing your favorite deck maybe, or a deck that you're not expecting in one of the categories. We feel we've got justified reasons for each of them. So moving into the first one, we've got Mega Ray. Mega Ray gains Rescue Stretcher, Tapu Lele, and Field Blower, which seem to all be naturally good fits to the deck. Obviously, when we saw Sudowoodo, everyone thought that Mega Ray was kind of done. But that being said, the fact that it just gains so much more in the early turns that Sudowoodo obviously is going to be an issue, but the deck can just speed up so much. It speeds up so much more. It's got good recovery through Rescue Stretcher now. It means you're not reliant on Dragonite if you want to shuffle things back into your deck, but it means that you can just grab a Dragonite from your discard, which is really, really good. Dragonite leads to picking up a Hooper and a Shaman, which leads to you filling your bench again, which is just so strong. Tapu Lele means that you hit Hex on turn 1 again, which is another really, really big selling point of Mega Ray. Meaning that you just sort of not only do you have a fast setup, but you also slow your opponent's setup. And it's one of the best things about Ray. I think Tapu Lele is naturally just such a good fit into Mega Ray. It's an insta-drop card. It gets you a good card from your deck, and it lets you carry on setting up. And you can also run more one-of supporters as well now. Jirachi's run in expanded Mega Ray, so there's no reason Tapu Lele won't be run in standard Mega Ray. And then Field Blower, again, just another really, really nice one-off card. Being able to get rid of annoying stadiums like Parallel as well without wasting a stadium is really, really big. But even when you perhaps haven't quite reached the amount of Pokemon on your bench that you want, being able to get rid of things like Fighting Fury Belts as well is just really, really big. I think they may not be huge inclusions in Mega Ray, but all 3 of these cards are definitely, I think Tapu Lele is probably more than a one-off, but Rescue Stretcher and Field Blower are natural one-offs, 1 to 2 offs that fit into the deck so well. And I think it makes the Mega Ray archetype just not maybe stronger than ever, but still just super, super strong in this format.
Yeah, it's gained a lot. I think don't just assume other people will play or be afraid to play Ray because of Sudowoodo being released. I think you actually need to be the person playing Sudowoodo, because if you're not actually playing Sudowoodo, Ray is just going to tear through you a lot of the time. It does have to worry about the new and the old Garbodor, of course. Field Blower helps out against old Garb, but Rayquaza is a deck that can't not play a load of items because it just needs too much to get going. So the new Garb is an issue for Ray. Coco could also be an issue, but I think overall Tapu Koko is fairly fringe. Tauros Garb will be top of the tiers, but that's just like one bad matchup for Ray, really. Lele sorts out a lot of things. As you say, going for early hexes means that like you can even be donking in situations by turn 2 because you've set up, 6 Pokemon or whatever, and you can just donk things because you've hexed and they don't really have anything in hand. Everyone else is going to be wanting to Lele turn 1, so stopping that is going to be really strong for you. And yeah, Rescue Stretcher is such a bonkers card for Ray. They currently play 2 Super Rod. Just straight swap for Rescue Stretcher is going to help you out in late game scenarios because it's a great card against N. In early game scenarios because you can still just get the one-offs whilst keeping your energy in the discard pile for Mega Turbo. It's just better all round, so such great additions for the deck. I think Rayquaza does gain a lot inherently. Even just playing Tapu Lele because it's a backup attacker is really good for you. It's more Pokemon on your bench that have a single retreat cost, so when the stadium is bounced, you always get rid of the clunky things as well, so you're not stalled as much as previously against things like Decidueye, because now your bench can be like 3 Shaymin and 2 Lele, and you've just got your Rayquaza in the active, and that sounds bonkers. Moving forward, I think the Psychic Energy is a cool option, just to heal your Rayquazas if you tank hits, because you are still a big HP Pokemon, and a lot of the time people try and just stall against Rayquaza. And definitely things like Decidueye. So if you can just heal yourself off with the Tapu Lele, it's going to be really good for you. I think because Field Blower's a card, there'll be a push towards going back to a puzzle list in Ray, because they'll naturally have more removal of stadiums, and it means you can puzzle for Field Blower yourself to then help out against Garbodor and stuff like that. So yeah, I think Rayquaza gains a lot, even though there are a couple issues for it. I think the deck itself just becomes a better 60 cards, so that's a worrying prospect for me. Next up is Mega Gardevoir, one of our favourites here at Omnipoke. Yeah. And it too gains similarly to Rayquaza. The decks actually act quite similarly in the fact that Rescue Stretcher is going to be fantastic for you, getting back Dragonites and just getting back more Pokemon. Again, while leaving the energy in the discard pile, because we'll have Mega Turbos, probably. Tapu Lele, just a fantastic card. You can be the one hexing people, just like Rayquaza does, or you can be tutoring out things like Skylar to make sure you're getting set up nicely. All sorts of good things for you. We also gain Sudowoodo, which is hilarious and awesome, and I'm so happy to see this make the addition into Gardevoir, because I've been so scared of playing against Mega Rayquaza for the last 3 months, every time I've been playing the fairy cards. And finally we have a counter to Mega Ray, which is fantastic. So the only real auto loss that Gardevoir was ever scared of was Rayquaza, as soon as Scizor sort of fell out of the format. And now that we have Sudowoodo, it feels like it's fairly plain sailing for Guardy. Obviously the item lock matchups are kind of awkward, but now we can Lele for Hex much more effectively, not only for the early turns to get us into the game, but also to Hex so that we can VS Seeker things back, like Lysander. So I think Guardy will play like double Hex, double Lele, most likely. A new threat for the deck is Sylveon, because it takes away so many energies. Stuff like Lycanroc Hammers as well would be really annoying. Even though we are going to be playing probably 2 or 3 Mega Turbo in the list, it's still awkward because Sylveon just has too much HP and too much disruption for us a lot of the time. So maybe that's an issue. Also, Gardevoir's not fantastic at dealing with Tauros, even though we have things like Field Blower now to get rid of Fury Belts if they are even playing them in the first place. We still have Rattata, but I think we would play Field Blower over Rattata now because it helps you get over Garbodor, the old one. And the old one used to be a big problem for Guardy, so that's something to be aware of. Moving forward, I think the straight build just gains everything that you can see on the left side of your screen. I think that's better in the straight build than it would be in the split mega build. So I think the straight list is the one that gains the most from the new set, so that's probably the more popular build in the future.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting Guardy out of the binder again and trying some of these new cards in the list. I think what's worth noting is we've always in the past few sets at least, the straight build always seems to gain so much more than the Xerneas build, but towards the end of a format or the end of a 3-month block, the Xern build seems to be more refined. So I think keep the Xerneas build in the back of your mind. It doesn't gain nothing. Like all of these cards, or some of these cards are naturally good in that anyway. But I think going into the format, straight Mega Guardi actually seems like a really, really good pick. And the fact that it has an answer to Ray now means that, yes, it maybe loses one auto loss and potentially gains another in Sylveon. I don't know that it's an auto loss yet, but it's not a fun matchup at all. But it's just going to mean the matchups are different, and I think people are more likely to be playing Ray in the early weeks rather than Sylveon. So I feel like in the first couple of weeks, Guardi could be a real top tier contender, and actually be able to deal with a lot of these new introductions to the format. Next up, we have Espeon Wobbuffet, a deck that has seen some fringe play over the past few weeks after the sort of rise of Decidueye, and things have been sort of improving and making Volk look better and things like that. So Espeon Wobbuffet has started to see some play. Me and Joe have been testing it a lot on the channel or on the streams each week, so you've probably seen us toying around with the deck somewhat. New additions, Ultra of the Moon is really, really big. Giving pretty much all of your Pokemon free retreat is just nuts. It means that Lysander Stall isn't really a thing anymore. And just being able to move Wob out easier and move your damaged Espeons out easier and stuff like that. Just the inherently having free retreat is really, really strong. Choice Band makes the math so much nicer as well. It's going to mean that the first attack on Espeon does 60 plus Confusion, meaning that if they flip badly for the Confusion, it's doing 90 to them. And at that point, you're sort of setting up your second attack to be able to knock them out the next turn. Because that's now doing a base 90. So with no energy, you're essentially being able to do two-shot things so much nicer with Choice Band. And the fact that, like, even on things like Wobbuffet, it just makes Wobbuffet maths nicer every now and again. You can just throw down a Choice Band in the late turns against something that's damaged, and your opponent doesn't really expect the Wobbuffet knockout as well. And then Field Blower again, just another really, really good card for the deck. I think Field Blower has already proved itself in the past few slides to be one of the best cards in the set. So the deck doesn't gain like a huge new attack or anything, but it just gains a lot of utility cards that seem to make it more favorable and more like an actual deck now, as opposed to a counter deck. It's like we said about Lurantis. You're no longer playing a counter deck. You're playing a deck because it's good that actually counters some really, really good archetypes in the format anyway. The fact that the numbers significantly improve, as we've said down there, means that this is the case. Tauros is still a bit of an issue, and the fact that Sylveon, again, all of these evolutions kind of counter each other in some ways, but the Sylveon being able to deny your energy is big, and just the GX attack of the Sylveon can be kind of oppressive against you as well. Your GX attack doesn't really do anything to them because it's just place 10 counters, which is just sort of doing taking half a knockout or doing 100 damage to a Sylveon, which is kind of irrelevant. You're not really doing much with that, so it's like you don't really have a GX attack a lot of the time, and it's not always as nice. So I feel like they're the favored evolution in that sort of scenario. But it's not unwinnable. I don't think it's not a nice matchup. Sylveon isn't a nice matchup against anything really, but it's not unwinnable. But it does I think it is a lot more awkward than people may realize.
Yeah, I think in that matchup, it's just pray that Confusion Flips beetle them out of the game, really, so that they can't actually tutor out their cards. I love the point that you make about the 1 for 60 with Choice Band. That's 1 for 120 if you have your other evolutions for type coverage, so that's just really, really strong. We'll have the support of Wobbuffet again, which can finish things off. Wobbuffet so good against the item block, as I've seen previously. Against Decidueye, it's amazing. Against Vileplume, it's amazing. The GX attack is good against both of those decks as well, which is awesome. You still have you've just got a lot of good matchups, and the Choice Band, yeah, the numbers just get so much better. 90 damage for 3 energy if they have nothing on them is just much more relevant. And the fact that you can now deal 180 to things with 3 energy is just so good. 180 is a golden number. Choice Band means you no longer even have a bad Darkrai matchup, even with the resistance. So Yeah, the deck just gains a lot. There's just much more synergy. As you were saying, the list itself just gets much cleaner, much neater. The archetype just has more synergy, and synergy is the reason why decks are good in the first place. So gaining the freedom of movement and gaining better damage is just really good for the deck. And the fact that other people will play Field Blower, it makes basic EXs worse because Fury Belt's worse. So just playing things with naturally more HP is good for you. So I'm pretty hyped to start playing this card. Even though Taurus Garb is an issue, I think the way around it is to play lots of non-EXs as well as Espeon, not just Espeon Wobbuffet. If you play it with things like Zoroark potentially, it means that you just don't evolve into Espeon in that matchup, or do it early game, for example, just so that you can like KO the Trubbish with the GX attack, stuff like that. So, yeah, I think you can work around Garbodor. Sylveon's probably the issue. You just hope to get good confusion flips, and then you like win the game from there. But yeah, this feels like it's a archetype that could start being like at least tier 2, I think, other than just being a rogue that people laugh at me for playing. Next up is the Umbreon build. I think Umbreon additionally gains a lot from Choice Band. Doing a 120-30 snipe is really good. And Strafe becomes a much more powerful option as well. We're doing 60 damage, as we were saying. Again, it can be 120 with other evolution type coverages. Field Blow is good because, again, it's sort of a disruption deck, so getting rid of things like Floatstone is going to be good for the Umbreon players. We gain Drampa GX as well, which is another card that can get rid of energy. And because we're strafing, things get damaged all the time, and Drampa can start getting one-hit KOs on things as well. So Umbreon seems to gain quite a bit. Again, this can be a card that just gets better inherently. It naturally has good matchups against the item blockers, Trevenant and Decidueye. Because of Wobbuffet, you'd have a good Tapu Koko because you're strafing into Wobs, and that's really horrible for Tapu Koko. They can't just use their abilities and switch into a new active, so you just actually 2-hit a Tapu Koko, which is hilarious. The threats would be Sylveon. In my head, the matchup is really weird. You're both trying to out-resource each other, which is great. I think if you're the Umbreon player, you're strafing a lot of the time to stay out of Flare Grunt range. The issue being that you're only doing 40 a turn with the Choice Band because of resistance. So Sylveon has a lot of time to try and disrupt you. At the same time, you're going to be the one Flare Grunting off them, so every time they search for a card, one of them has to be a Fairy Energy in the first place. So it feels like a really weird matchup to navigate. Just a strafe war versus search, and then maybe Umbreon at the right times can hit the Judge or a N or something like that to try and just go into the active for a turn and try and actually go on the aggressive. But overall, I think it's probably a bad matchup for you. I think Sylveon will just have too many Skull Grunts and stuff, and they can just puzzle back for Enhanced Hammer, which is really good against Umbreon. So I think it'll overall be an issue. Taurus Guard was also probably not great. Tauros was always one of the biggest issues for Umbreon. Even with Choice Band, you can do like 60. 60 is a bad number to hit against the Tauros because they can Lysander KO a Lele or something like that. Or they can just hit you back with a Rage or something. And then 60 and 120 does get the knockout, which is much better for you. But it's still awkward, and you're still going to be playing quite a few items. You're going to be playing Floatstones that people can Field Blower off you. Choice Band as well, which is also extra damage for them. And the fact that Umbreon Hammers doesn't have much acceleration, much recovery in terms of energy, the Garbodor can probably just start getting over you, especially because you can only hit 90. Choice Band, of course, not doing extra against the non-EX. So, yeah, feels like it's got a couple new bad matchups, but again, itself just gets much better as a 60-card deck, so potentially it'll see some play.
Yeah, definitely. I think Drampa is one of the something that a lot of people, I mean, not a lot of people, but it is something that has kind of gone under the radar for this deck. You're naturally going to be taking a hit on random things that you just throw into the active anyway in the early turns. And Drampa's just a really, really nice clean-up Pokemon. Being able to do 180 for 3 energy means that you're running DC anyway, so it's just a DC and an attachment. As long as you've got something damaged on the bench, you're knocking out an EX Pokemon. So it's cleaning up the game really, really nicely, which I think is another thing that Umbreon sometimes struggled with. Mm-hmm. The 90-30 was always a nice, like, it's a good attack, but sometimes it just wasn't quite enough. Spreading the damage rather than being able to control it all on one thing and just take a big prize. Drampa can now do that, so Yeah, it's a really, really nice deck. And when I was saying, when we were talking about the Espeon Wob, the evolutions matchups are all really, really weird. They're like, I'm still not sold on how any of these 3 or 4 decks
Fight each other.
properly win
Yeah.
against the other one. It's just going to really, really depend on how they play it. So yeah, it's presenting itself to be a really, really interesting format. Next up, we have Umbreon Zoroark, the more aggressive sort of build of Umbreon Zoroark. Ultra of the Moon means that everything is, everything potentially has a float stone, and it's going to make Zoroark so much better as well. It means that you're less reliant on finding these float stones and stuff. You can actually throw a choice band on Zoroark instead. Be able to apply more pressure and still have free retreat with that great ability. So that's really, really nice. And yet again, obviously, choice band making the numbers for Umbreon so much nicer. 120 with the right evolution, or just 120 naturally with a 30 snipe as well. It's just really, really good numbers. So it's going to mean that the deck is more aggressive in general, which I think is what the deck needed. Again, it was a deck that kind of felt a little bit lackluster in the damage department. Sometimes it just didn't quite do enough, or it never quite had the damage to last until the late game. But just the addition of choice band means that you're able to be so much more aggressive with your attacks, and really, really apply a lot more pressure. And against things, against things like Sylveon, it's a really, really weird matchup, and I think it isn't particularly favourable. Sylveon having resistance plus denial is a big deal. You do have a different attacker in Zoroark, but unfortunately the break isn't all that useful against them. You can copy their attack for 110, which goes down to 90 before choice band, so it's not even two-shotting them without a choice band, which isn't great, but it is only 1 energy, so that's probably one of the lines you could go down in that matchup. Just being able to attack for 1 energy and potentially two-shot them is probably the line you have to take. Zoroark break in general will always become more versatile. The more GXs we get, and there's going to be matchups where you just don't get any value out of Umbreon GX's GX attack. So the more GXs we get, the more Zoroark break becomes more versatile, as we've said, meaning that you are going to be able to pull a GX attack that your opponent perhaps isn't fully expecting, or isn't fully playing around. There aren't too many amazing ones in this set. There's nothing sort of huge, like we've said. Sylveon, you kind of don't really get any value out of a lot of the time anyway, because they often only have maybe 1 or 2 bench. And some of the time it's going to be like a Lele or something like that anyway. So it's not really helping too much, because they can just bench this stuff straight back down. It's not like they're going to be attaching a load of energy and setting up a big attacker. And then Ninetales isn't too good as well, simply because you have less HP than it. So a lot of the time, you're just going to be throwing sort of 120 onto them or something like that, which kind of isn't doing anything really. You may as well be using the natural Zoroark's attack anyway. So it doesn't gain the break doesn't gain any amazing new sort of wombo combo GX attacks that you didn't have in the first place, but the card is naturally just going to get better and better as we see more and more of these GXs. So that in comparison, sort of as well as choice band, means that I think the deck is aggressive enough now to present itself in the format, rather than just being another Umbreon deck that sort of saw fringe play before.
Yeah, I think this is one of the decks that benefits the most from choice band in terms of numbers. It means a full bench is a 1-hit KO for Zoroark. I think it's 190.
Yeah.
160 if they have a 4 bench, which means even Kukui gets the KO. So it's really hard to play around Zoroark's numbers now, and that's really good. I like that you mentioned the Zoroark break is probably the line you take against Sylveon. That's what I had in theory. But I think if you play like if you play like 6 dark energy, you won't probably get there. So Sylveon will probably just beat you. But yeah, I think it's got a long list of good matchups. Playing the evolution support just means that you out damage things as a really powerful non-EX attacking deck, and you have the Umbreon support just to snipe things, put things into Zoroark range, or just to strafe in the early turns to slow them down. You probably will play still like 1 or 2 Wobbuffets just for the item lock to get set up behind, and then you can Altar of the Moon out of there. So it seems like it's got good matchups, and it's just, again, it benefits the most out of any deck I think we've spoken about so far from choice bands, so just really, really strong. Next up we have the adapting decks. Volcanion gains Turtonator GX, which we've already stated we think is going to be no more than a one-of in the deck, but it is a really good one-of in the deck. for giving you great energy recovery. It's also going to help out a lot against some Garbodor builds, because if you choose to play Choice Band in your list, I imagine Fury Belt just goes out of Volcanion because of Field Blower. I think you probably just increase your Floatstone count to probably like 3 or 4, and I think maybe you make the room for 1 Choice Band potentially, just for early aggression with your baby Volk, or potentially to put on the Turtonator, because Turtonator can go up to 190 with its regular attack for 3 energy, and that means that you still get 1-hit KOs against things, even if there's a Garbodor in play stopping your abilities. Again, Volt can play Field Blower now as well, so it can get rid of the tools in the first place to get things like Fury Belt rid of, and you can also get rid of Floatstones on the Garbs, which is great news for you. So Volk does gain a couple of things, but really its adaptation is going to be because of the new threat of Garbodor. Volk was a deck that played 4 Male, 4 VS, 4 Ultra, 4 Max Elixirs, and never really batted an eye, and there was no reason for it not to play those things, because the main item lock decks are grass types, so your hope is that you can just baby Volk through them anyway, and win the game, even though you're playing a huge amount of items in the list. Even things like Energy Retrieval, Floatstone, Escape Rope. Like, this plays a silly amount of item draw, and just cards in general. So the new Garbodor is something that does tear through Volcanion. Also, there's the threat of Aqua Patch, meaning there's going to be more water decks around, like Lapras in a more aggressive form, and Ninetales. These are issues for Volk, definitely, but it's just in the early months or so. I don't think many people will experiment with Ninetales. I don't think many will experiment with Aqua Box potentially. I think Tauros Garb is an easy enough deck to pilot, just because we've seen it similarly previously. So I think that will be the new contender, and that's worrying for Volk, because the deck can't really function if it goes slowly, and it does need Elixir support a lot of the time. So how it adapts around that will be interesting. I don't know if people will still be playing Trainer's Mail Engine. Maybe we'll be playing heavier Skyfield and play Oricorio to search the energy from the deck without having to cycle so heavily with draw cards. I think that's something that I want to test out. It may not be very good, but it's an option. But overall, I think the threats are not too much for Volk to overcome. I think it can still be a big contender in the format. It's still just very aggressive, very powerful. Not too many things make me think that Volk won't survive. Even though it doesn't gain much, I think it's still just a real decent top-tier deck.
Yeah, it's super consistent. The fact the deck's super consistent, and then in the matchups where your opponent's item locking you, you have type advantage anyway. I think that naturally makes Volk one of the out of the sort of straight off the block, one of the best picks or one of the best decks looking at the sort of field naturally. Again, as you've said, we're gonna have to maybe adapt the list to accommodate for Garbodor a little bit more. But I think the list can probably do that and still be potentially as consistent as possible. And even if it can't, like, that's still only one matchup. We don't know how good Aquabox and Ninetales are going to be, especially in the early weeks. So just even though the deck maybe will just take the loss to Tauros Garb, and Tauros Garb will be a good deck, it's still only one matchup, and it's still going to have really good matchups against the majority of the of the rest of the format anyway. So I think even if it can't find a very nice way of dealing with Garb, it's not like the deck is bad. It's just one matchup that you just want to pray to dodge a little bit on the day. And against the rest of the field, you're just as consistent as ever, doing what Volk does, and just seem to be getting better. You've got, like you say, we've got Turtonator GX, which is just a nice one-of in the deck anyway, which provides potentially another avenue for the deck to go down as well. So yeah, I think Volcanion, whilst it's not maybe thriving, it's still one of the best decks going into this new format, just because of the kind of deck it is. Next up, we have Yveltal Garbodor, a deck that's kind of just floated around for the past 3 months. It was really, really big in the Evolutions format, and it's just kind of been there, but not really doing much over the past in the Sun and Moon format. Turbo Dark really was the dark deck to beat, and it did beat Yveltal Garb a lot of the time. So it meant that Yveltal Garb kind of took the backseat, but now it seems that Turbo Dark maybe isn't as good in the new format, and Yveltal Garb gains a lot of different things. Drampa GX is a really, really nice mid to late game attacker for the deck. I think being able to Y Cyclone, set it up, and just do a huge amount of damage for 3 energy is really, really big. It kind of reminds me of or the builds that we're or the cards that we're seeing in the Yveltal deck now kind of remind me a little bit of a more expanded boxy type Yveltal list, having maybe 1 Tauros, 1 Drampa, things like that. But yeah, Drampa's a really, really good card. It's got energy denial as well, which is a cute little thing that you can, cute little way that you can sort of deal with some of these maybe quad DC decks and stuff like that. Rather than trying to set up a huge attacker, just run them out of energy. So it definitely brings some real nice sort of different avenues for the deck. Choice Band, again, Yveltal's naturally a card that's going to enjoy Choice Band. It enjoys doing huge damage anyway, so I think being able to sub in your Choice Bands for where your Fury Belts used to be, obviously you're not getting the plus 40 HP anymore, but you have to assume that your opponent's going to have Field Blower a lot of the time anyway, so just having an extra 20 on top of the plus 10 that you were getting from that means that you're going to be pushing for knockouts a little bit more. You're going to need 1 less energy to be able to get some of these bigger knockouts. So yeah, Choice Band's naturally going to be a good card. Muscle Band was always played in Yveltal Garbodor, so Choice Band naturally fits in anyway. Field Blower itself, again, just another really, really good utility card. It's not going to be a huge amount of, but just having as a 1 or 2 of, it's just going to be a really, really good, again, utility. It's no like big card, but it's just having more disruption whilst throwing a huge Yveltal in their face means that your opponent's going to have to find more and more cards to be able to deal with this Yveltal. And then Ultra of the Moon, again, giving everything free retreat, or pretty much the whole deck ran on 2 retreat, and you never really wanted to attach float stones to your active or to your Yveltals just because you wanted them to have Fury Belts. Your Fright Knight also switched off your float stone, so like that now naturally has a float stone on it as long as you can find Ultra of the Moon as well. So yeah, it's just a really, really nice stadium. I think it's such a big stadium for Yveltal Garb. Obviously, Coco is a threat just because of the typing. That's why Coco, I think, is being talked about as a card anyway. But again, Sylveon and Tauros Garb are 2 decks that look to be really, really good coming out of the format or coming out of this new set for Yveltal to deal with. Sylveon denying your energy and then being able to, if you're trying to set up Yveltal on the bench, being able to GX attack and put it all back into your hand is just really, really, it's going to put you behind so much. So Sylveon, I think, is and the resistance on Sylveon as well is just going to be really, really difficult to deal with. They have 1 energy on them as well, which means your Evil Balls are doing very, very little damage. You're going to have to set up a lot of energy, and at that point you play into Lysander GX range. So it's kind of just a really, really difficult matchup naturally. And again with Tauros Garb, you kind of play into Tauros quite well just because it's quite difficult to knock out a Tauros in 1 hit early on in the game. So you can always assume they're going to be able to take a couple of prizes from their first Tauros. But Garb is going to be a bit of an issue for you just because you're playing you're playing the Max Elixir engine anyway, so you're going to have more items than a lot of other decks. So Garb in the late game is going to be a non-EX attacker that can apply as much pressure as Yveltal itself can. So at that point you're losing the prize race. So Tauros Garb is a bit of an issue as well. I think moving forward, Fright Knight it means that Field Blower sort of isn't. It's difficult for the Fright Knight to get value anymore. The big thing about Fright Knight was this ability. The 60/60 Snipe was big, and the fact that we're seeing probably less Shamans and more Lele's now means that we're not getting as much value there. But the big thing about Fright Knight as well was the locking of items or the locking of tools, and the fact that we can just Field Blower them off now means that Fright Knight isn't really all that relevant. I think 1 Fright Knight is going to be still nice, potentially just as an option, but I don't think it's... I think we're at a point where if you're playing Yveltal, at least 2 Fright Knight was very, very important, and now it doesn't seem to get anywhere near as much that the value that it used to get. Muck may sort of take the mantle over Garb, just because you don't need you wouldn't need Floatstone in the list anymore because you have the stadium, and it means that you can't be your ability lock can't be Field Blowered off as well. They can then Lysander stall you because they can Field Blower the stadium out of the way, but like that's less important than them Field Blowering your Floatstone off of your Garb. So like we may see more of the Yveltal Muck engine, but I think Yveltal just in general seems to not necessarily lose much in this new format, and gains a bit more of a boxy archetype, but a lot more pressure as well.
Yeah, I like the boxy style. I think Drampa will be not only a one of, probably a two of, as like the combined attacker with Yveltal. I think it'll be like a Drampa plus like one Tauros and a couple of Yveltal, just because Yveltal still is like an efficient mid-game attacker where you can retain some energy whilst doing good numbers and setting things up. It's worrying that Sylveon and Tauros are probably not great matchups, even with things like you can try the new or the Ancient Origins Sableye to copy their supporters to try and get rid of their energy and try and like do the same thing they're doing to you, to try and stall them out. I think that's been an option, but I still don't think it's that strong for you. Obviously, playing non-EX Yveltal can only get you so far against Sylveon because you're doing 10 damage or you're doing 40 with the Choice Band. That still doesn't seem that strong. So yeah, I think it's awkward against a couple of these decks, but I think Ultra of the Moon is something that you shouldn't sleep on, and how impactful this card will be for the deck. It could function similarly to Turbo Darkrai in that you just have 4 Yveltal EX and a Hooper, and you just go for like Elixirs and go that route, because you'll be doing all the Y Cyclones anyway, and then you can just freely retreat when something's damaged. I think that could really be a decent archetype, so the way we've seen Turbo Dark, it may just become Turbo Yveltal as well, so that's something that you need to keep an eye on, and it's something that I want to try out as well. So definitely adapting. It's sort of been adapting since Sun and Moon, and it hasn't quite found its feet yet. And I think Yveltal's going to continue to try and adapt to survive in the format. Fortunately, it has enough tools and enough versatility to remain, a consideration. And it'll continue to do so, I think, in my eyes. Next up, we have Gyarados. It gains Rescue Stretcher, which is like so much better than Buddy Buddy Rescue. Oh my god. So fantastic for the deck that you can finally get rid of Buddy Buddy. Buddy Buddy's a card that can help out your opponent. It means they can play one tech attacking Pokemon and just beat your deck because they use Spinder, you knock it out, but you have to Rescue Stretcher. No, you have to Buddy Buddy your Magikarps back, and then you just give them back the Spinder. So, yeah, Rescue Stretcher's so much better than that. It's great for you. It's going to be fantastic. Field Blower as well is helpful. Getting tools off things like Garbodor, getting Fury Belts off so you can get one into one hit KO range is going to be pretty cool for you. And also more Stadium Replacement. That's sometimes an issue for Gyarados, but typically you get there anyway. So yeah, a couple of additions for Gyarados. I think Rescue Stretcher's like really, really amazing as an inclusion for Gyarados. The list is already like pretty much 60 cards perfect, but now you can make one extra slot because you normally play one Super Rod, 4 Buddy Buddy. You gain a slot just by playing Rescue Stretcher, and the 4 cards that you put in are better cards in general, so that's good. Threats, obviously Trevenant is a problem. It's another deck that's Vileplume, so if they just go first get Plume, you've lost the game because it's so difficult to set up under item lock for the Gyarados players. And even if you go first to try and get set up, they have the Trevenant Break that can just spread at any point in the game and win. So that sounds really horrible. Tapu Koko, the promo, is also going to be an issue. It's not coming out immediately. I think it's in a box that comes out like 2 weeks after the main set.
Yeah.
But as soon as that comes out, it's a DC attacker that does 20 to everything. And that's horrible. So I think Mr. Mime probably becomes a staple as soon as Koko comes out. You may even make the space from the choke, because then you're not worried about Decidueye and Trevenant as much. The only times you lose then is turn 1 item lock. But beyond that, you might be okay, but probably not. I don't know. Who knows? I think Gyarados is actually still really fine. It's got good matchups against things like Tauros, Garb, and Sylveon. And if these are going to be as top tier as we're considering, that's a really good thing to have. You also have, obviously, a pretty easy Volcanion. So having like good matchups against 3 of the big contenders and only really being scared of item lock seems pretty good for Gyarados. I think it'll, again, just keep rewarding the brave players that actually go ahead and play it, I think.
Yeah, it's a non-mover for a reason. It doesn't... Everything it loses, it gains another answer to. So it just kind of pretty much stays where it is. And if you've got the guts to play Gyarados, I think it's definitely a format that can still reward that. Next up, we do have Decidueye Vileplume, a deck that doesn't change too much. I think it's still very good. It's still oppressive. and it's still super super strong. But it just kind of like everything it gains, it potentially loses in other forms. Tapu Lele means that it's going to mean one of Decidueye Vileplume's biggest crutches is its turn 1 setup. It's going to mean that this is so much easier to do. You're going to guarantee yourself as a porter. You're going to guarantee yourself some new cards to be able to try and build your board, build these pieces in the early turns, try and find this turn 1 Vileplume and start locking your opponent out. Also gains Sableye. Again, we're not 100% sure what this card's going to do for the deck, whether it's going to completely peter out and be useless, whether it's going to make the listing even more oppressive and be a staple. It's kind of, we're not 100% sure yet. I'm not too sold on it, but it's definitely one to test, because if it does happen to work, then it's super super strong. New threats, Sylveon. Obviously, Quad Lapras in my eyes is a good matchup. Or Quad Lapras has a good matchup against Decidueye Vileplume. And Sylveon seems to do it a little bit better because you search the deck for 3 cards rather than just draw 3 cards. So even under item lock, you're getting exactly what you want. You're getting your Hex and 2 hammers, or you're getting you're just getting what you want, which is so much nicer than just drawing 3 cards. And even just the drawing 3 cards was sometimes enough to beat Decidueye anyway. So it's just going to make it's like going against Lapras, but them drawing exactly what they want each turn. So it's naturally going to be difficult. Drampa also is a pretty big issue. Not only can they discard your energy from the active with their first attack, your DC is at least from the active with their first attack. Their second attack means that if you just do 1 snipe to the bench, they're doing 150 for 3, which is really really big. And the fact that you can never one-shot a Drampa means that they're going to be dealing a net 300 damage against you a lot of the time, which is just really really big. Their GX attack isn't like majorly irrelevant, but it does give them an out to just being locked out of Vileplume as well. So Drampa seems to be a bit of an issue for the deck, just because it provides so much net damage along with some disruption, which I think is one of the best ways of beating Decidueye Vileplume, is just running them out of energy and forcing them to just be stuck at these abilities for damage each turn. So Drampa, I think, is potentially a pretty big issue for it, especially if it's kind of splashable as well. Tapu Lele is just better than Lugia, I think, in the majority of cases. I wasn't too sold to start with, just because Deep Hurricane is a really, really big amount of damage, especially under item lock. But the fact that Tapu Lele, well, a lot of the time you were aeroballing anyway, so Tapu Lele is doing the same thing, but it also has this ability as well. Just means that I think that you don't really lose too much from losing the damage. As I said with when I was talking about Tapu Lele a minute ago, the deck loses to not setting up and not building a board rather than not winning quick enough. Because as soon as you've got the board, you kind of control the game from there. So Lele seems to just be better than Lugia now. So that's the kind of list that we're going to be seeing. Obviously, we're going to have to see whether Sableye works in a rainbow style list. We've seen rainbow lists do well recently, so it definitely could be the route that Decidueye takes. We've just got to sort of test Sableye and see whether this little 60 HP Pokemon has enough HP to survive and provide enough oppression to win the game anyway. And then Espeon could start to be splashed as well, just as an out to Sylveon. Being able to just knock out multiple Sylveons in a turn potentially could be one of the lines of play that you have to take against Sylveon to be able to win that matchup. So it's definitely, I think the list doesn't gain or lose anything. It's just going to be how the sort of attackers that you add into the list to be able to deal with the new format going forward.
Yeah, I agree. We put it as a non-mover despite Tapu Lele increasing your turn 1 potential, because people have more potential to hex you on the first turn and find hex at any point in the game, because they'll be playing Tapu Lele as well. So as much as Decidueye inherently gets set up more often, it gets hex turn 1 more often as well. So that's potentially an issue for the deck. I still think Decidueye Vileplume will be a top tier deck. Sylveon will be probably an issue. I think Espeon EX is near staple, depending on how frequent Sylveon is played. And I think Sylveon should be played pretty heavily. Similarly, there'll be other evolution variants, and there'll be things like Ninetales and Trevenant Plume and stuff. So there'll be plenty of reasons why you'll want to play Espeon EX. So I think that becomes less of a tech, more of a staple going forward. And yeah, I personally am not a fan of the Sableye Rainbow Energy version, just because I think your tech attackers are slots that aren't draw cards, and I would rather just get set up on average more often. I think that's how you win games as Decidueye. I love the Tapu Lele edition over Lugia. From my early testing with the Decidueye Plume, I've loved having Lele. It means that you can play Lily as a one-of as well, which is kind of cool for early game setup. But it just means that you don't get absolute jank hands like that much more often. So yeah, I think it goes straight in over the 2 Lugia. I know people will make the debate for Deep Hurricane, but I just think that you win the game when you set up. So just get set up more often, you'll win more games. So yeah, it gains a little, but also everyone else has Lele, so they can try and hurt you just as much. So yeah, I still think it remains pretty good. Next up, we have some declining decks. Quad Lapras. Although it gains a few things, it gains Aqua Patch, it gains Brooklet Hill if you want, so that you don't get donked as often, which God knows I would have loved. And it also gains Field Blower, which is really good for getting rid of Float Stones for more stall potential. It also has to worry about Sylveon, which it will probably lose to, because Sylveon always gets the answers. And Lapras doesn't always get the answers, because Lapras is drawing cards, Sylveon's tutoring cards. Also has to worry about Lurantis and Trevenant Plume, because they're both grass decks, and as much as you want to draw cards, it's really bad against Trevenant. And Lurantis doesn't really care about energy disruption, because it has so much good recovery. So I think moving forward, the Lapras deck was just the version that we saw before Sylveon came out, and now that we have Sylveon, just play that deck, I think.
Yeah, there's not too much to say about these declining decks. Sylveon just seems to be the better Lapras deck right now. I think maybe for a week or two, people will just carry on playing Lapras just because it's easy to throw some of these cards in. But I think once we have at least somewhat refined Sylveon lists that the community likes, then it's just going to be a better deck. Next up, we have Turbo Dark and Dark Dragon, something that you may be surprised to see down on the declining decks. Turbo Dark has been debatably one of the best decks, if not the best deck in format for the past 3 or 4 months. It does gain some things. Ultra of the Moon means that like everything has free retreat, so no more float stones. You just run more EXP shares, and all of a sudden all of your dudes have free retreat, provided you find your stadium, which is really, really good. Choice Band again. The deck's naturally a 2-shot deck, but you can ramp into 1-shots. And being able to choice band instead of theoretically add an extra energy instead of just the extra 10 from fighting Fury Belt means that you're going to ramp into 1-shots quicker, which is obviously a really, really nice prospect for these dark decks. And then Sableye can be a nice sort of tech attacker against some things. It can disrupt your opponent for a turn. Maybe you've got nothing else to do. It's a nice addition, especially as you're running dark energy and stuff anyway. So it's a nice non-EX attacker. But the big thing is there are a lot of new threats for the deck. The list of threats just sort of at least push Darkrai out of the top spot, possibly down far enough where, like we say, Yveltal is the dark deck to play now. Obviously, things that are able to you're not able to one-shot anything a lot of the time. The deck is really reliant on 2 shots and just gaining value and sort of never really losing much when you when your opponent takes a knockout. You're preserving all your energy, and eventually you're getting into that 1-shot range. Things like Lycanroc one-shot it now. Ninetales heals all the damage off, and can actually one-shot you. Now they're running Choice Band as well, and you're running Choice Band instead of fighting Fury Belt. They can one-shot you, and they can also heal themselves. Aquabox again can heal itself, which is really, really good. Sylveon. Lapras was always kind of an awkward matchup for Turbo Dark. It was a real 50-50 matchup some of the time. But Sylveon again is just a better Lapras deck, plus has resistance. So it's going to mean that even though you theoretically have less HP than a Fury Belted Lapras, your opponent's doing 20 less damage, which is really, really big. Plus they can also make you pick up your two most your a lot of your energy in a turn from their GX attack, which is just going to put you back 4 or 5 turns some of the time. If they can pick up 4 or 5 energy, that's taking 100 damage off the field plus resistance is just not nice to deal with at all. And then Tauros Garb, again, it's an item-heavy deck. It's got elixirs, it's got lots of tools, it's got trainer's mails, it's got ultra balls, it's got all of the sort of speed cards to try and get into these turbo dark rise as quickly as possible. And Tauros is gonna, it doesn't like ever hitting into a Tauros because they can usually one-shot them back with Mad Bull. And then late game Garbodor is just going to eat them up once they've used all of their items to ramp into their energy and that kind of thing. So it means that it gains a lot of not fun matchups, and there's all of the matchups that we've just talked about that seem to get better. And the fact that it doesn't gain anything amazing, like it gains some nice utility cards again, but nothing that sort of means that you should play this over your Yveltal. It's really, really difficult. Field Blower getting rid of the XP share is another really, really big sort of loss for the deck. It means that if your opponent does knock you out in combination with a Field Blower on the previous turn, you're actually losing energy. And as soon as Turbo Dark starts losing energy, their numbers start reducing again, and they really peak in sort of the mid game where you don't want to be sort of peaking at your maximum damage. You want to be able to take knockouts right at the end of the game. So because of this, I think Darkrai could be no longer the oppressive force that it was. You always had to have a good Turbo Dark matchup going into a tournament, but now I think Yveltal does seem to be the Dark variant to play, just because it gains a similar amount of cards as Darkrai plus one good attacker as well, but it doesn't gain anywhere near as many bad matchups, and it doesn't really when Darkrai doesn't really gain any good matchups in this coming out of Guardians Rising.
Yeah, it gains no healthy matchups and it gets more headache, and really it is for me Field Blower the biggest pain because it loved Fury Belt for tanking, and most importantly, it loved the XP share for losing 0 damage. Now, one Field Blower getting rid of 2 XP shares, like, you may as well just shake their hand now because you're losing 40 damage, and it's going to keep happening every time you get knocked out, so you don't snowball like you want to, and that's how Turbo Darkrai functions. For the Dragons build as well, it seems similar. Less impact that you lose the XP shares because you try and ramp with double dragons, so maybe the dragon list becomes the more popular variant of Turbo Darkrai, but I still think it has too many issues against the energy denial decks. Sylveon and Tauros are just better because they'll be playing Enhanced Hammer, so that's a problem. It's so sad because I love Ultra of the Moon. If we just didn't have Field Blower and we had Ultra of the Moon, I think Turbo Darkrai is like super strong. So as long as people play Field Blower in a lot of decks, this deck won't remain, I don't think, a top tier threat. It's still a non-EX that can still ramp and be powerful. It's just it doesn't have the snowball, and the snowball is the biggest thing about Turbo Darkrai. The fact that you can just simply attach for a turn and attack, and that's enough to win you the game. Like, that's no longer the factor of Turbo Darkrai, and that's why the deck was so good. So probably going to be seeing a lot less play. Next up is Mega Mewtwo. Its biggest gain is its biggest threat. It can play a tech Garbodor in its list, but anyone else playing a Garbodor-focused deck is going to be horrible for you. I'm also considering that Espeon and Gardevoir will probably pick up in play. We said that they're both rising and gaining a lot from the new set, and these are all issues for Mewtwo. I think if you want to play a Mewtwo-style deck, looking towards Ninetales is probably the best thing to do. It does gain a couple of good matchups, Tapu Koko, because it just gets one hit KO'd, and Mewtwo was typically always good against the Vileplume variants because it can choose to play Wobbuffet, it can play Double Hex, it can play Garbodor if it wants, and in general it can just tank hits from the Trev and then just dish them out quite nicely in response. But as long as Garbodor sees as much play as we're expecting, I would assume that Mewtwo is going to hide under a rock because its weakness is just too much of a pain right now.
Yeah, I think the fact that Garbodor has been printed, but Espeon and Gardevoir seem to be both doing a lot better in this format. It means that Mewtwo has sort of seen its day for now, and I actually think Ninetales does what it is very, very similar in archetypes. So yeah, if you're a Mewtwo fan, I think testing Ninetales would be the first thing I would do to try and maintain this kind of deck style. So that's all of the currently good decks. Finally, we just want to talk about some reviving rogues, things that you could be seeing on the tables when Guardians Rising does hit. So we're going to be talking about Persimmon, Greninja, and Groudon, and what they gain, what they lose, things like that. What they gain, what matchups they gain, things like that.
Yeah, so first of all, it's going to be Persimmon, my old favourite. As soon as it came out in Sun and Moon, I thought this was potentially a really good deck. And now that we see Sun and Moon 2, I think this is potentially a really good deck. Persimmon gains Rescue Stretcher, just like Gyarados, which I think is such a really powerful card. And being able to play 4 copies of it is going to be fantastic for you. You also gain Tapu Lele. And I think Persimmon will be similar to Night March. When Night March first came out in the UK, as soon as we got Hex Maniac, there was a build of Hex March going around, and I think Persimmon is going to be very similar to how that functioned. The idea of the Hex March was that it played a load of item draw, just tons and tons of item draw. You end your turn on a Hex Maniac, and from that turn you're going for 1-hit KOs because you've got your Night Marches in the discard pile. I figure that Persimmon is a simple enough deck to get going. All you need to do is start hitting Ball Search cards, and you get your damage. As soon as you do that, you can drop the Lele, you can find a Hex, you can Hex people. Hexing against the item lock is going to be obviously really important. Item lock is still going to be an issue. If they get it on before you, it's going to be really horrible. You can still Lele for like a Bridget and get lots of Persimmon down and start trying to pressure. But that's just, still kind of niche. But anyway, I think Lele improves a lot of things. Even potentially a backup attacker for you. Persimmons are going down in the late game and you've run out of rescue stretchers and stuff. Choice Band is another huge thing. Choice Band pushes Mew's attack to 150. 160. So Kukui gets you to 180. So you can actually one-hit things now. And when you're a non-EX one-hitting things, that's really good. I think playing Heavy Shaman, Heavy Tapu Lele will be fine, because you're going to be playing Skyfield, and you're going to be playing Rescue Stretcher anyway. So you just get rid of them off the board, and you're left with just non-EXs. You can even play Oranguru as well to help you out against N. So look at these favourable matchups. Tauros Garb is going to be great for you. You just one-bang the Tauroses, and you don't care about Garb hitting 300 damage, because they're doing it on a non-EX anyway, and you can just respond KO on them. Sylveon seems fairly easy. I think you'll be playing 2 Special Charge and 4 Puzzles, so I think you get there over them. Me and Jack had the discussion. I think mainly the fact that you can Field Blower your own Skyfield, so you have no stall targets. They can only ever Lysander up new Persimmons. I think that's favourable for Persimmon. Gyarados is favourable because you're both doing the same thing. It's just you always get the first hit because you're a basic Pokemon, so you get a first KO on a Magikarp. Groudon seems okay because, again, just too many non-EXs that you can just keep swarming. Evolutions seem good. Obviously, if it's the Umbreon, you have weakness on them. And if it's the Espeon, you have weakness on them because you're playing Mew as well, so you just one-hit through them quite nicely. The Aqua Box is probably an issue because your damage output isn't always 2-hit KOs if they're going to be rough seizing and retreating. Yveltal Guard potentially an issue, depending on how many Drampers they play, because Yveltal actually has resistance, and that's sometimes awkward for numbers. Guardy, I found, was an issue for Persimmon when I first played the deck, because they can tank hits, retreat, and Despair Ray off the board to deny prizes, and you never have easy Shamans that you can just catch her up and KO, so Persimmon has a lot of good matchups. I actually think this time round it could be much better, just because the fact that you can end on Hex Maniacs for the first 2 turns and slow people down, and as long as Persimmon forces people to have slow turns for turns 1 and 2, you just overwhelm them, I think, too often. So I really think Persimmon is a simple enough deck that it gets set up every single game. If you can weave in Hex Maniacs throughout, you're just going to win a lot more. So I genuinely think this could be a contender in the format.
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting one. I think the simplicity of the deck is a huge thing. Choice Band again is another really, really big card. I've just been doing some numbers in my head while Joe's been talking, and you can one-shot Shamans with Persimmons now, which is another really, really big thing. Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely merit to the deck. We've just got to see sort of whether it can compete with some of these other decks in the format. But when Simeon was first released, it did seem like the new Night March, and it never really took off. But now it's got a little bit more consistency, a little bit more recovery, just a couple of little things. Maybe that's enough for Simeon to take off and be able to actually be a big contender in the format. I think the fact that it's non-EX as well is just a really, really useful thing. Next up, we have Greninja, a deck that again is kind of close to my heart. So I'm kind of happy to see that it may still be back, or it may be back. Field Blower it is huge, meaning that Garb isn't an issue anymore. One of the big things for Greninja was the fact that if your opponent set up a Garb, it at least took a turn for you to knock it out, which meant there was at least a turn where you weren't applying this incredible pressure from the break. And now that you have Field Blower, you can Field Blower their Floatstone off, and then carry on applying pressure. You can double snipe the Garb so they can't reattach a Floatstone, or you can just take another 2 prizes or whatever. So Field Blower is a huge, huge card. Rescue Stretcher is really, really good recovery, especially just being able to get it straight back into your hand. Being able to get another break is just really, really big. Recovery was another big thing for Greninja, and the fact that you can get it straight into the hand is really, really nice. And then Choice Band. Greninja has always been a deck that provided it sets up, its output is really, really incredible. It's a bit, and it's not ability locked. And the fact that you've got Choice Band against these EX decks, whilst you're sitting at EX HP as well, meaning that Choice Band isn't an issue for you, is just really, really big. 170 HP, doing 110 for 1 energy before snipes is just huge. That means with 1 snipe, you're doing 170, and with 2 snipes, it's 230. So you're knocking out a huge amount from the format. So Greninja seems to actually gain some really, really nice cards, utility cards. And one of the only reasons that we've sort of seen Greninja drop out of play was because Garbodor seemed to be pretty oppressive, and the fact that we have an answer to that is really, really nice. Obviously, again, there's a huge list of favorable matchups. Volk, you naturally, I think, have a good matchup against now, just because you don't necessarily need your abilities. You can hex them, or you can lock them out of their abilities, but you can also one-shot them with Choice Band now, which is really, really nice without relying on your abilities. So you can start setting up other things as well. Gyarados is obviously going to be a really, really nice matchup, just because you can get rid of all of the Magikarps they ever put down, so they're kind of capped at doing nothing, which is just really, really good. Yveltal Garb. Now you have an answer to Garb. I think Yveltal Garb is actually a good matchup. Back when I played it for London, I didn't dislike the Yveltal Garb matchup, provided they didn't have an insane turn 1 to be able to sort of automatically set up 1 or 2 Garbs in the next couple of turns and stuff. I think I actually went positive in testing against Yveltal Garb. So now you have an answer to one of their biggest win conditions, which was just setting up a Garb. It means that the matchup is I think favorable for you now, especially as you both have the same HP, but your tool actually is relevant now that they're not running Fury Belt, and even if they are, you have Field Blower anyway. So Yveltal Garb seems to be a pretty big sort of gain in the favorable matchups department. Sylveon, being able to pick up the EVs, provided they don't attach them straight away, is really, really nice just naturally. But I think Sylveon in general it's never really applying too much pressure, because you're holding so much energy, or you're discarding it through just using the ability anyway. So you've either got 1 energy in hand, so they're Skull Grunting 1 energy away a lot of the time, which is no big deal. They can never really Flare Grunt you, because you want to be applying pressure anyway, just by doing 80 a turn. So they can never Flare Grunt you. If they Skull Grunt you, they're discarding 1 energy. The rest of your energy is just going to be in the discard, because you've just done 120 to them for the turn or whatever. It means that you can also one-shot a Sylveon, which is huge. It's one of the only decks that can, because you don't have resistance or anything. So being able to, if you manage to get the tools out to set up 2 Greninja breaks, you can actually one-shot any Sylveon that they drop, which is really, really big. And I think Sylveon doesn't apply enough pressure, even if it does go aggro, it doesn't apply enough pressure to mean that it's sort of unlikely. I think Greninja can actually set up against Sylveon a surprising amount of the time, especially if you can actually get a decent an early turn Frogadier. It's going to mean that they can't even use their GX attack to pick up 2 breaks, because essentially you could have a 3rd break and another Greninja out to just evolve to the 4th break. So it, like, as much as them picking up 2 Pokemon can be an issue for you, like that's like a stage 2 line or a stage 3 line, I guess, but you don't have Froakies. If you can get a decent water duplicates off, it doesn't matter, because you can potentially have 4 Greninja out anyway, which is just nuts. Mega Guardi was always kind of a favorable matchup, I think, anyway. Just because you apply so much pressure with your damage, and you're a non-EX, so they have to clear the majority of their board to one-shot you. If it does get to the point that you're the break, and that's a huge commitment to do 2 or 3 times. They can reload, but if you can just set up enough Greninjas to mean that they're not one-shotting you, then you gain so much damage through just being able to Giant Water Shuriken them down anyway. And then Passimian, I think, again, because it's a non-EX matchup, that you naturally have a kind of good matchup against, provided you have a decent setup. I think Greninja will always kind of struggle to it being Greninja and it not drawing well and stuff like that. So Greninja things is still a threat, just because the deck plunks itself out and it doesn't draw the right cards at the right time. But I think the Talonflame build is the build or is the style that you have to go with now, just to avoid getting locked out of item lock and things like that. Other threats, Lele finds Hex now, so people are going to have more access to Hex, which means that you're not going to have your super strong abilities anywhere near as often. But the fact that you can, I think the format's slow enough, or maybe slowing down enough, that even they have to chain Hex for a few turns for them to some decks to overcome you. I think even if they just let it slide for 1 turn, you can gain a lot of value out of the ability. And then item lock is always kind of going to be a bit of an issue. But I think, as we've said, the Talonflame build seems to be the better build right now, which means that you can just tutor out the exact 2 cards you need for the next turn. So it just depends on sort of how the Vileplume, what the Vileplume list is, and like what attacker they're using, and how early they get this Vileplume, because sometimes you can shoot your way out of the lock anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I think Greninja's actually really viable. Choice band 110 plus 60 is silly numbers. Field Blower means Garb's no longer the issue. That was previously the only way that we really had an answer to Greninja. As long as it sets up, as you say, Talonflame is probably the way to go. I think it's got a lot of good matchups. Decidueye and Trevenant, just through weakness, are horrible matchups for you. But in our theory craft, our list, we're playing Energy Denial. We're playing double Flare Grunt. So I think with Talonflame and Flare Grunt, you have an answer to those matchups even. And on certain turns, you can like Greninja Snipe to KO the Vileplume, and then you can VS Seeker on those turns that you KO the Plume with abilities, VS Seeker for more grunts, and just try and run them out of energy. So Greninja may not even be horrible against those matchups, as long as you start Talonflame and actually can draw into them. So yeah, I think Greninja is coming back into the format in a big way, and it feels like it has a lot of good matchups. Speaking of good matchups, here's Groudon. There's been whispers of Groudon here and there. It was played a little bit in Brazil by a few people. Played in Utah as well, I believe. So people have been picking up on Groudon for its decent matchups against Decidueye, because of Wobbuffet, of course. It's obviously got a great matchup against Energy Denial decks. Quad Lapras, the only way Quad Lapras tried to win the game was trying to N and Paralyze, to hope that the opponent doesn't have an Olympia or a PCL or a way out, just like a Switch or something. So that's the only hope, to try and like KO like 2-shot a Groudon if you're the Lapras player. Obviously Sylveon won't have that option. They can try and use the GX attack potentially, which could be awkward, but I think overall Groudon just has enough time to win the game. Once they've spent their GX attack, you can just put everything back down and start reattaching, because I don't think they ever get through enough Wobbuffets to take the 6 prizes in time. So yeah, you're pretty good against that. Pretty good against Taurus Garb, I feel. because you can just slow roll the Groudon. You can just attach 4 times an attack without using many items. We have Brooklet Hill, which I think is a good addition for the deck. I think Groudon will play this card because it means you get it even if you have a Groudon that's active and you're under item lock, so you can actually find more Groudons. I think additionally you want to play a lot of stadiums because Primal Groudon's attack needs stadium. So rather than playing a couple Heavy Ball, I think you play a couple of Brooklet Hill on top of your other stadium cards, which is pretty cool. You're pretty good against the other Mega decks, Rayquaza and Guardy. Obviously, if you're playing Assault Vest against the Ray, that's the way that you try and remain healthy. And Mega Gardevoir, you like guarantee yourself 4 prizes as the Groudon, if not more. So pretty good. For threats, Trevenant Plume is pretty horrible. They just don't set up Vileplume and they set up 3 Trevenant. I think you've lost the game. Gyarados is pretty bad, even under Wobbuffet, which might slow them down a little bit. I think they just have too much recovery that they can afford to 2-hit your Groudon because you're never really going to take 6 prizes before they get through you. Persimmon, in a similar case, will do the same thing. And evolutions sound pretty awkward because the Espeon can put 10 counters on your Groudon, which gets it into 1-hit range when you do finally come active. And similarly, Umbreon can do sniping as well. So there are definitely threats for Groudon. It looks like things like Persimmon, Gyarados, and the evolutions, I don't think you'll see much of these in the opening weeks. Potentially Trev Plume is the only bad matchups for Groudon in the first few weeks of the format. So this could be really solid. Yeah, I think Groudon, again, there's a lot of reason why you can like him and just easy mode a few big new decks.
Yeah, I've been trying to make Groudon work since about December, so I'm happy to hear this. Yeah, definitely some really, really interesting matchups, good matchups for the deck. So I think it's a good early pick. Maybe as the format evolves and matures, it may see less and less play, but I think it could be a good time for you to bring out Groudon from the binder and just see how it does against some of these other decks or some of these new decks in some League Cups and League Challenges and stuff like that. And maybe it's good enough to stay in the format in general. So yeah, general shifts in the meta. That's pretty much all of the individual decks we wanted to talk about. Just in general, we've been able to see some natural sort of pointers from just what we've been talking about. Garbodor seems to remain relevant simply because it gains an attacking variant as well. So Garbodor in itself, I think we'll see play anyway, even with Field Blower out, just because even if it's not ability locking, it's just going to be taking prizes anyway. This could cause a bit of a shift from these heavy item draw decks or at least engines, which means that we may be building decks in a different way in the future. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen immediately, but I think, again, once the format sort of matures and evolves, we're going to see more of a maybe more of a Pokemon-heavy search or Pokemon-heavy style draw engine or things like that. Things like the Oricorio that's going to search energy rather than rather than Professor's Letter, stuff like that. That kind of shift in the meta. I think after a couple of weeks, that could kind of be where we see this format go. Alolan Muck plus Wally seems to be a very, very consistent form of ability lock, simply because Field Blower seems to naturally be a good card, so a lot of people are going to be playing it anyway. So Alolan Muck plus Wally could be the new ability lock that we see, especially as Wally is so much more accessible with Lele now. As long as you don't mind ability locking yourself turn 1, you can actually find Wally into Lele into Wally so much easier. So that could be our new big ability lock, as opposed to Garb being the ability lock, simply because it is Field Blower proof, which is really, really nice. It's going to mean that decks move more towards that instead, which I think is definitely an interesting trend. It's going to mean that we have potentially two different ability lockers in the format, just dependent on whether you want to be able to access this attacking Garb as well. Energy Denial seems to be something that the new set has made stronger, so we could see sort of techs like Energy Keeper carving and stuff like that seeing play. Some people in Brazil, I heard, were starting to play them anyway, so maybe that's the way forward. Sylveon seems to be a very good deck going into this format, so having like they don't have a huge win condition at that point if they can't run you out of resources. So just playing Carbink can shift a matchup completely in your favor, which is really, really big. As I mentioned earlier on, Lele being in the format now means that more of these one-off supporters are much more viable. Things like Lily, Skylar, Fan Club, Wally, things like that. You are going to be able to get benefit from them in the early turns, then ditch them and not have to worry about drawing into them off of an N or something later on in the game. So I think that's definitely really, really nice. It's going to increase the consistency, plus increase the creativity of some of these lists as well. It's going to mean that we see some of these perhaps underused supporters a little bit more, which is really, really nice. And finally, it seems that Choice Band is the tool of choice over Fighting Fury Belt a lot of the time, just because it provides immediate impact. It provides a plus 30 automatically, whereas Fury Belt only provides a plus 10, and the 40 health can just be sort of ignored or removed with Field Blower later on in the game. So Choice Band seems to be the tool of choice at this point, which is kind of what we expected anyway, but it does seem to be that is the case.
Yeah, definitely. I think just going back to a Lowland Muck, I think that is the big point here that I want to make in the meta. I think a Lowland Muck seems really, really strong. Volcanion, Aquabox, Tapu Koko are all hugely ability reliant, and then you just have the fact that you've done it turn 1, so people can't Lele, people can't Shaman, they can't draw nicely. That's really annoying, even for the item lock decks that have abilities on stage 1 and 2 Pokemon. They can't Shaman and they can't Lele, so they can't actually get into their combos as consistently. It's pretty much the same as a Hex, but it just remains on the board, so the opponent is never let off, really. It's also really good for Ray and Guardy. It's good for so many things, like, oh my god, if you're just a Lowland Muck, like, as long as you have, like, a reasonable attacker in the background, I think it's good. That's kind of why I thought Yveltal Garb will adapt in that way, because it's just going to try and beat people down, because they've gone for Wally Muck turn 1. They've got that, and then they just start beating people down with Evil Ball, because they're not setting up, because they never got their Shamans going and stuff. So, man, I think that's, like, the biggest key to the format for me. And in the general sifts, I think Alolan Muck is, like, going to be the king of the format at some point, just in some sort of deck that has other basics surrounding it, because it doesn't need abilities itself and just beats people up. So, seems pretty cool to me.
Yeah.
So, the new metagame. This is summing up really what we have been chatting about and how we feel you should consider the top decks in the format right now. We're saying Turbo Darkrai, Quad Lapras, and Mewtwo are much less of a consideration in the meta, and we have the additions of Trevplume, Tauros, and Sylveon for the brand new decks, and also the returning cast of Greninja, Persimmon, and Groudon. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think there's not much to describe. We've already sort of argued our cases for why we think some of these decks will be seeing less play or seeing more play. But yeah, that's how we think it will be panning out in the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, for sure. So let us know what you think of the new meta game, where we think it's going anyway. Maybe we haven't considered something. Maybe we've overhyped or underhyped something. Let us know down in the comments what you think, or whether there's anything that you would change about this. Other than that, I don't think there's much else to say. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. We've got an Alolan Muck here. That's the main point of the video. Go and buy your Alolan Mucks now, because this card seems to be getting a lot better in the next few weeks. So yeah, if there's one thing you're taking from that, go and stock up on Alolan Mucks. But yeah, unless there's anything else to say from you, Joe.
That is all for now. We have spoken so much about Pokemon. We hope you all enjoyed it. Like, comment, sub, all that good stuff. Tell your friends, and we'll be back with more deck analysis, as well as these sorts of reviews in the future.
Sure.
Stay tuned for our top 10 Spirit Link video. That is going to be exciting. Cheers, guys.
Bye-bye.
Stop.